Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Special Education Legal Fund's March webinar on IDEA state complaints. We have a great webinar for everyone this evening, and we're really excited to get started. My name is Christine Lai, and I'm the Executive Director and co-founder of Special Education Legal Fund. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our 2022 sponsors for their support of Special Education Legal Fund and our webinar series over the past year. I'd like to acknowledge WealthSpire Advisors and Winston Preparatory School at the gold level. And at the silver level, we are thankful for the support of American School for the Deaf, Fusion Academy, Shrub Oak International School, Villa Maria School, and Chapel Haven Schliefer Center. And finally, we are incredibly grateful to both Eagle Hill School and the Windward School as our bronze level sponsors. Thank you again to our 2022 class of corporate partners. We could not do this without your support. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, I'd like to take a moment to introduce Special Education Legal Fund. Special Education Legal Fund was founded 5 years ago in 2018 to provide resources, knowledge, and support to families in need with children in the special education system. Since then, we have provided over $600,000 in grants for legal support and advocacy support to over 170 families across 60 school districts in Connecticut and Westchester County, New York. We have two grants programs for families, the Legal Assistance Program and the Advocacy Support Program, which are both currently accepting applications. The Legal Assistance Program is the attorney grant program, and it provides families in need with up to $5,000 in legal support from a qualified special education attorney. The Advocacy Support Program provides families in need with up to $1,000 in advocacy support from a qualified non-attorney advocate. And for information about both of these grant programs or to begin the application process, please visit our website at www.spedlegalfund.org. I will put that information in the chat later on. Our next webinar on April 12th is coming up, and it is on the very, very popular topic of executive function. We are going to talk with Winston Prep, Villa Maria, Fusion, Eagle Hill, and Dr. Lauren Reardon from the Waverly Group, talking about how we can support students with executive functioning needs. You can sign up via the same platform Eventbrite that you used to sign up for tonight's webinar. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our Andy Feinstein and Chris Rowe. Andy is probably well known to you if you're familiar with SEEK, Special Education Equity for Kids, and their informative discussions covering special education legal issues. Andy has over 25 years of experience practicing special education law on behalf of parents and families, and he's deeply involved in the special education community, both in Connecticut and nationwide throughout his work for SEEK, as well as his work for COPA, the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates. And Andy is an all-around great guy who's been an invaluable supporter of SELF since before our founding, really. He's been a fixture on our webinar series. This marks his, fourth or fifth webinar appearance for us, and we are so grateful for his expertise and support. Welcome back, Andy.
Thank you.
We are incredibly pleased tonight to welcome Chris Rowe to our webinar panel. Chris serves as the Director of State Policy for the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates, COPA, and he supports COPA members in that capacity by advocating for policy supporting students at the state and local level. He's also co-chair of the Special Education Advisory Council for New Orleans, the co-founder of Sunshine Parents, an advocacy and support group for parents, and the founder and president of Enabled Learning Partners, where he supports families and organizations that are strengthening special education programs. In addition, Chris has just finished a comprehensive multi-state review and analysis of state complaints, the process and results, and he's going to share that with us tonight on his first SELF webinar. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you.
And because it would not be a webinar without a disclaimer, here we go. This webinar panel is presented for informational purposes only. This webinar is intended as a resource for families who are navigating the special education system in Connecticut, New York, and should not and is not intended to provide legal support, advice, or assistance to any particular individual, nor is it intended to replace the advice and counsel of a qualified special education attorney. Families in need of legal advice, support, or assistance should contact a special education attorney licensed to practice in the state of their residence to discuss the specific needs of their individual student. This webinar should not be construed as an endorsement by Special Education Legal Fund or any of its representatives, of any of the participating attorneys, advocates, or other professionals, nor should it be construed by an endorsement of any school or school representative invited to appear in the panel. So what is a state complaint? Andy, I'm gonna turn this over to you so that you can talk about the state complaint process. And I'm going to show this.
Okay, should I wait?
You can start talking. I'm just getting situated here.
Federal special education law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, mandates that each state have a complaint procedure, and this sets certain rules relating to that complaint procedure. Just to put it in broader context, in order to get federal money, each state promises that the requirements of the IDEA be followed by all local education authorities, all local school districts. In order to carry out that commitment, a state really needs to have a system to investigate what local districts are doing. In many states, including Connecticut, very little is done in terms of random audits and targeted investigations of districts. The main enforcement mechanisms are state complaints and due process hearings, private actions. It's our opinion that the state should be doing far more to enforce compliance with the law, but state complaints may be one of the greatest ways that there is for the state to monitor what local school districts are doing. So anybody, including a teacher or a third party, can file a state complaint. There are internal procedures for state complaints, which are not published by the state of Connecticut. Just an appalling situation. They have to be filed within 1 year of the incident complained of, but the content of the complaint is really up to the person submitting it. Now, the most important thing I think to say is that the state is looking for violations of clear law. They are not looking, for example, the state complaint process will not look at whether a district offered a child an appropriate education. That determination can only be made in a due process hearing. But as a violation of law, state complaints, really, the results of state complaint investigations really do need to be publicized, which they are not in Connecticut. They're not indexed. They're not generally available. They're available in response to Freedom of Information requests. And so we've had situations where the state has said, District A, you're doing something wrong in this following practice. And so District A stops doing it, but District B and C continue doing it because they have no knowledge that the state has made such a finding. And the final point I want to make about all that, I suppose, is that there's been a practice in the state of trying to force parties to mediate complaints. Now, if complaints are just about a grievance between a parent and a school district, well, maybe mediation does work that way. But if the idea is to enforce the law, to explicate the law, to make the law known to all school districts, that is just an unacceptable way out. That's really do need written findings by the State Department of Education determining whether the complaint is valid and whether the action complained of is in fact a violation of state or federal law.
Jump forward.
Oh, sorry.
There you go.
You're doing this part, Chris?
Can you like think? Now it won't let me advance.
Okay, I'll do it.
Sorry.
Step 1, filing. Step 2, state review.
There you go.
Perfect. Is that it?
Yes, that's it. Andy, do you
Well, I
want
mean,
to?
but the point is that after it comes into the state with maybe a little bit of review, maybe a lot of review, the state Department of Education determines either to go forward with a full investigation or to dismiss the complaint because it violates statute of limitations, because the information doesn't allege a violation, or convinces the complainant to withdraw the complaint, which happens with some frequency. And and mediation is one way that they do that. Now, the state investigation generally involves sending the complaint to the school district and saying, "What's your response?" And the school district responds, and but it's extraordinarily rare that there's any on-site investigation. There may be a request for further documents from the district, but in terms of interviewing people and seeing what's happening on the ground, that's not something that state complaint generally leads to.
So if we step back a little bit to, the filing process for the parents who are on the call, what are some typical issues that are addressed in the state complaint process?
Go on, Chris.
Let me take that. Yes. Well, as Andy mentioned, it does need to be related to IDEA. So one of the major areas relates to evaluations and child find.
Mhm.
As Andy mentioned, also procedural issues. Like I was just working on a state complaint today with some folks that I work with here in Louisiana. There was an issue around prior written notice. The school is not using prior written notice as they should be to inform them about meetings, to who's going to be at the meetings and so forth. It can also relate to issues such as violations if they're using shortened school days, for example.
Mhm.
So there can be a range of different issues, and there are some resources out there that actually walk people through beyond just what you'll find on your state Department of Ed's website. But there are some tools out there that can really walk a parent through. If you have this particular issue, here's the IDA statute that you should be referencing. Here's what supporting documentation might look like. And then part of the filing as well needs to be, what is your proposed solution? So if I'm filing a complaint on a particular issue, the complainant also needs to suggest what would be the solution or the resolution to that problem.
Mhm.
And one of the most effective areas is the IEP promised, an hour a week of speech therapy, and the district has not provided it. And the state, is likely to, once verifying that, order the district to provide it.
Mhm. So
But
that's pretty
so the
clear.
question, so if the IEP says you're entitled to an hour a week of speech therapy and you don't get it, that's a valid source of a complaint. If
Mhm.
the IEP says you're entitled to 15 minutes a week of speech therapy, but you
And
think
you want 45.
and you want 45, that's a question of faith, and that's
Right,
not
and
something
that's
the
not
state
for the
complaint
state
process.
complaint. Got it. That's helpful. What about a situation where, all of the kids in all of the kids with IEPs are grouped together in a single classroom, and there's no integration between that classroom and, and the rest of the grade or the school, the typical peers? What type of situation, would that be?
Well, there is provision to handle systemic complaints,
Mhm.
where there's a policy that violates the IDEA.
Mhm.
In If there's a policy that says all kids with IEPs are going to be segregated, I think that's probably something the state would act on.
Mhm.
If, however, the following 10 kids are being segregated and we think they should have a more inclusive program, I think that's a question of FAPE and LRE that it's likely the state would not act on.
That's great. That's super helpful. I think that's really, laying that out is really, really helpful, to help parents understand, the process. I think we talked about the investigation and what the investigation entailed, which it sounds like from both of your perspectives, very little, in terms of, actual on-site, investigative work. What happens after the state's investigation? What happens once the investigation is completed? That's step 4.
And did you want to take that or?
All right. Well, I mean, there's a letter from the district, from the State Department of Education to the district saying, here's our findings and here's the corrective action we're ordering. And that's made available to the complainant. And it can be available through a Freedom of Information request, but is not routinely publicized. There are a number of states that do routinely publicize these. A substantial number of them redact the school district's name, which I think is really unfortunate.
Right. That makes it kind of unhelpful, generally.
Unhelpful. And moreover, you want I'd like to know how many complaints are filed against each district each year.
Right. Absolutely.
I think that should be a real trigger to the State Department of Education to do some focused monitoring on that district.
And to your question, Christine, that is one of the things that should happen under best practice, is that the State Department of Education should be looking at the data year to year to identify those trends and to identify systemic problems, so that they can then target their assistance and outreach to parents. The state is also required under federal guidelines or federal statute to reach out to parents about the state complaint process, to engage them and help them understand what the process entails and how to actually file the complaint. Now, again, whether that actually happens or not is another question, but yeah, that should be happening at the end, in addition to ensuring that corrective action is carried out, I think within 1 year under statute. They should actually be looking at the data to identify what's going on so that they can, improve.
Absolutely.
Now, Chris has some interesting state-by-state data here, right?
Yeah. I'm going to get into that in just a second. You want to talk about oversight and administration first? I think we've kind of dabbled a little bit in this particular area. But there is, as Andy mentioned, there is oversight, but it is quite weak and quite ineffective, to be honest with you. And part of the research that I've been doing for a forthcoming report really gets into this more from the federal level. I don't know, Andy, if there's anything you wanted to add additionally from a state perspective or a Connecticut perspective.
Well, I mean, the first thing to understand is that the U.S. Department of Education, the feds, monitor what states do, not what local districts do. It's up to the state to monitor what local districts do, and they're obliged to do so under their annual plans that they file with the federal government in order to get Part B funds. So that's the oversight and monitoring. The other issue, though, which is extremely troubling, is the sanction that the feds have against states and the sanction that the state has against local districts is the withholding of funds. That's just a ridiculous penalty. That just punishes the kids. And so it's for that reason, it's I would say never used. I mean, there were 2 threatened actions by the feds against states, which were settled out and funds were never withheld. And I don't know of any case where Connecticut has withheld funds from a local school district for failure to comply with their determinations. On the other hand, it is my sense that in Connecticut that where this corrective action ordered, districts tend to follow it.
Okay. That goes to a question from the audience, which is, what happens when a district doesn't honor the state's findings and corrective action?
And that's exactly right. I mean, if a district refuses to follow what the state orders, state will make more phone calls, I guess. I don't know.
Hmm.
There's not much that except for the withholding of funds, or
Mhm.
if it's what's known as an alliance district, then there's a power of the state to take over the district. But
Mhm.
that has not happened for
That
this.
doesn't sound like
this-
it, a very common, occurrence.
Yeah, no, it's not. The There's another question I see, which is the absolute central question of 2023. What if the district has to provide a certain staff member and can't find that staff member?
Right.
And that's I'm not sure that's necessarily related to the complaint process, but my view is if there's an IEP service that the district cannot provide, then it's, parents have every right to go get that service privately and then go after the district for reimbursement for the cost of that service.
And we're seeing that quite a bit with, districts, lacking, speech therapist, BCBA, occupational therapist for, months on end. And, parents and families who have that in their, in their plan, very rightly are looking for those services to be provided. But that gets into the whole, compensatory education piece, and which is an entirely different, and separate webinar, probably all of its own. But that's helpful, and thank you for answering, that question, Andy. That was helpful. So it sounds like, there is, this is it's sort of a 60-day process. There's a determination that happens after, some investigation, not CSI level investigation, and then the determination is made, but there's not a lot of enforcement of that determination of the corrective action beyond, maybe a slap on the wrist at the end of the day.
I think we've got to be thinking about other remedies.
Mhm.
I mean, it's the cutoff of funds is not a very viable remedy, and it's counterproductive. But fortunately to date, there's largely been district compliance with what the
Yeah.
state's ordered. But that's been part because the state's ordered so little.
Mhm.
And there's also been that sort of cooperative feeling. But we're seeing, efforts by some local school
Okay.
districts to get quite independent about this. And I'm sure this is going to become a much bigger issue as time goes by. And let me just answer one other question that was in the chat, which was, is there a mechanism in place at the state level for tracking district complaints, or is it not used or doesn't exist? Well, Brian Klimkowitz, the
Special education.
special ed the division director for special education in the State Department of Education, says, "Oh, I look at them all, and if there's a cluster of them in a district, we will do further action in that district." And so I don't know. I don't think there's a formal system for tracking number of complaints by district over time. I've certainly never seen data like that. I suspect it doesn't exist.
But correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, at least in Connecticut, adjudicated due process hearings are published on, are publicly available, correct?
Yes. Well, they are published.
Those are published. So I'm just curious as to why, why state complaints wouldn't be viewed the same way, and published the same way that due process hearing results are published.
I agree with you. And, I've been pressing Brian and his predecessors on this, and the commissioner and her predecessors on this for years. And they say, "Oh, we're working on it. Oh, it'll happen. Oh, it's too big a job to redact. We don't have all this information." But it hasn't happened. And, and they're also, targeted monitoring that the state does to some extent. And there are reports from that targeted monitoring, and those should similarly be made public.
What do you mean by targeted monitoring? Can you explain that for the audience?
It's a system where the State Department of Education does a deeper dive on what's going on in a district. I don't think it's very deep. I don't think it tends to involve, it tends to be much more paper exercise.
Mhm.
I mean, my view is there ought to be a team that goes in and interviews parents, interviews teachers, interviews administrators, reviews IEPs, looks at the process manual, and makes a determination whether the district is fully in compliance with the requirements of the IDEA.
Yeah, the targeted monitoring sounds like somebody's making a phone call to somebody else. And, I mean, that's kind of what it feels like. If the parents aren't involved in it, then it doesn't seem like it's very much monitoring. But but that's helpful to. Oh, sorry, Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, one example of that at the federal level, the same system of monitoring of states. There's a cycle of monitoring. States are supposed to be monitoring with on-site every 5 years, and there's an annual data collection and kind of forms that states fill out and submit, kind of desk audits, if you will. But then there is a special category, which they call emerging issues, which is similar. But is one example in the state of Virginia, parents flooded the Office of Special Education Programs with complaints about the state monitoring and the state due process system, in particular state complaints. And this resulted in a targeted monitoring visit to the State Department of Education, specifically on the issue of dispute resolution. And it turned up just massive gaps and problems that, lo and behold, had never been discovered before in any previous monitoring, because they weren't looking for it, right?
Right.
So in that instance, it did take, a number of parents engaging directly and saying, hey, we're having lots of problems here in Virginia. Can you do something about this? And then they did.
Right.
So that was a really interesting example, I thought.
So that would be a good, exercise for parents in a particular district if they were having systemic problems, related to, the special education, would be to, kind of band together and, have an organized filing of, complaints, in the particular district, and hope that the volume of those complaints caught the eye, should catch the eye of the the individuals that are administrating this, and and in oversight. So that's actually something that could be done really in any district. It would just require the coordination of of the parents in order to do so.
Another area,
I'm
sorry, getting a little ahead of myself. Another area that's worked is that Brandy's discussion, very few states, I think about 15 right now, actually publish in some form the state complaints. But we have a number of states right now with COPA members that are actually FOIA-ing all of those state complaints on a year-by-year basis. And then you can publish them yourselves. So the state doesn't have to publish it. You can get the data and publish it yourself. Candace Cortelia, who runs the Advocacy Institute, has on her website a number of, she doesn't tell them that systematically, but she has a number of state complaints that people have submitted to her as examples of how to submit a complaint. This is what happened when a complaint got filed. But there is another way to do this, which is, again, parents or citizens basically getting the information and publishing it themselves. A lot of work, though.
Yeah, because you would have to file a Freedom of Information Act repeatedly, and for that, to have access to that information.
Right.
But it is something to think about for sure. I have this question here is, what is the statute of limitations on state complaints? And I think, Andy, you said it was a year, correct?
1 year. 1 year. There are a couple of other questions here. The issue of redaction. One of the issues of great concern to me is the wild overinterpretation of the confidentiality requirements in FERPA. FERPA is actually very limited. It just relates to records. There is nothing whatever in law that prohibits the release of class lists, for example. There is nothing that says that the identity of a student getting an IEP cannot be released. And, you know, there seems to be a real effort here to make people embarrassed that their children are receiving special education services.
Yeah.
And that makes it very hard to organize. That makes it very hard to get press stories out of it. And there's nothing to be embarrassed about. The confidentiality, the overuse of confidentiality is being used as a way to create this level of embarrassment. Now, I think, on the student's name, that should be up to the student or the parent as to whether that's redacted. But in no case do I think the district name should be redacted, or the area of the complaint, or things like that. There's a question about child find here, and that is an issue which I'm afraid would need due process. The state complaint process is not going to second guess a determination by a district that a child does not qualify or does not even qualify for an evaluation to determine whether the student qualifies for special education. There's a question about the district claiming to have provided service and the parent knows that there's no service provided. Again, if there's hard evidence of that, as the questioner posits, I think that is something that the state would look into. But I think that it would be an enormous burden on the parent to demonstrate that the district is lying. There is no appeal from a state complaint. If you file a state complaint and the State Department of Education finds no violation, you still can file for due process, but the district can and will use the state's determination of no violation as evidence. It's not conclusive, it's not binding on the hearing officer, but it's very, hearing officers tend to rely on it. And so I would not look at a due process case as a way to appeal a negative determination on the complaint process. If you're inclined to go to due process, go to due process. The big advantage of the complaint process is it should be a do-it-yourself statute. Right. You should not need a lawyer or an advocate to do it for you. You can go ahead and file it yourself at no cost.
It's relatively quick.
Yeah. And then there's
relative to due process
turnaround.
Right.
Just like an Office of Civil Rights complaint. Due process. I would strongly advise anybody not to do it without a lawyer. Parents win about 5% of due process cases they do by themselves, whereas we win about 45% when there's a lawyer. The statute of limitations is 1 calendar year. So it happened if the violation happened on April 1st of 2022, you would have 3 weeks now to file it. There's a question about use of video evidence. I assume if you sent the video in, the state would take a look at it.
Perfect. I'm gonna take over here and ask Chris to start his discussion about the about his state by state data analysis, because I think this is really fascinating, and we will delve further into those questions in a little bit after the presentation, as well as talk specifically about Connecticut and possibly New York and what you've seen in the trends in those states. So love to do that if that's great. And Chris, just tell me when to scroll forward and I'll do so.
Sure. I'm just going to give a really brief introduction to kind of how I got interested in this. I'm also a parent of 2 boys on the autism spectrum with a range of other issues. But I'm also an advocate. And here in Louisiana, I filed a state complaint a few years ago, and it just disappeared. It was like it had never existed. So that kind of left me frustrated and scratching my head and was wondering, well, what is going on? And then when I joined COPA a little over a year ago as Director of State Policy, I heard a lot, as I talked to our members around the country, just about challenges and frustration with this entire system. So we held a little webinar last spring, and we had over 500 people that registered for it. So I was kind of shocked that many people were interested in this kind of seemingly arcane little piece of the, special education law.
Mhm.
So that started me down kind of this path of really wanting to understand what the data tells us. And there is data that's collected annually, and it's collected by districts and up to the state and then up to the federal government. And it's published through what's called the Civil Rights Data Collection. So the data is out there, it's available to be looked at. U.S. Department of Education, as I said, makes the data available. It's usually a couple years old by the time you get to it. And there's other people that do some basic analysis on it. But using my data analysis cap, and I love looking at data and analyzing data, I was wondering, well, what's the difference among states? So I like to look at data in comparative manner and then try to find outliers, because if hopefully the system is working somewhere for some parents, right? That was my hope. But I also had a hunch that it's not working really well in a lot of places, right? That was my hunch. But the data as it was presented really didn't allow us to kind of discern those patterns. So what I did, if you can advance to the next slide, I took the data, as we were just mentioning, published from the U.S. Department of Education through its Civil Rights Data Collection. And I really thought about looking at the data kind of as like almost a throughput analysis. Like if we take the data from the beginning, where parents file the complaint, they've got a problem, they said, I really want to file a state complaint, follow it all the way through kind of that roadmap that we showed earlier to the end in terms of what happened, at the end of the pipeline, how many of those complaints actually get investigated, how many of them have findings, and then of those reports that are issued, what's the breakdown?
Mhm.
Is the state always finding
For the parents or for
the
the
parent, or the opposite? Are they always finding on behalf of the schools? And I would expect, given the range of issues that we all face in many states, and given the range of this, the process itself is fairly uniform across states, I was expecting we wouldn't see huge variations from state to state, but I was wrong. So if you can just jump forward to the next slide. This first slide really just kind of looks at the overall activity levels.
Mhm.
So how many complaints are being filed in each state?
Massachusetts.
Massachusetts. Yeah, so I'm taking 3-year averages now so that we have a little bit, it's not just one year when it spikes but it's a 3-year average. These are complaints filed per 10,000 special ed students. And you can see on the left end, folks are busy in Massachusetts.
Yes, they are.
They far away lead the nation, with Connecticut pulling up in the number 2 spot.
Right, by half. Yeah, which is interesting. Yeah.
But followed by Mississippi.
Mississippi. Yeah.
Which was kind of strange. I know that you have some folks from New York that attend, so I highlighted the New York numbers as well in blue. But they're definitely on the low side in terms of numbers of complaints filed per capita, if you will.
Yeah.
So if we jump to the next slide and really kind of looking at, let's follow them down the pipeline and see what happens. The first step really is, once the complaint is filed, how many of them are dismissed or withdrawn? And unfortunately, we can't tell from the data which ones are actually being dismissed by the state, because the state said you didn't meet the criteria for filing the complaint, or how many of them are withdrawn by parents. But if we look on the left side, North Dakota, for example, 2 out of 3, in Louisiana, my state, essentially 2 out of every 3 complaints that are filed are dismissed or withdrawn. So I was having that conversation today with a couple of parents who are getting ready to file their state complaint, and I was trying to prepare them.
Yeah.
If
For
you
the
don't file
likelihood.
this,
Yeah.
you don't file this exactly correct,
Right.
you really only have about 1 in 3 chance of this complaint actually getting investigated. So we really have to be careful how we file. Connecticut is one of the higher states in terms of, slightly over half.
Yep.
are dismissed or withdrawn, compared, and New York's not too far behind,
Mhm.
compared to the way other end of the scale in Alaska and Nebraska, virtually every single complaint that's filed makes it through this step.
Yeah. And
So
actually
that's,
Massachusetts, it's pretty,
yeah,
is on that end as well.
exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
Even though they have that
So
huge
even though they
volume,
have a lot of complaints being filed, most of them seem to be, making it through the process.
and they get through that first
Yeah.
cut, basically. Yeah. So huge range. I mean, I was shocked to see there's that much variability from state to state.
No, that is,
Next slide. I'm not going through every metric that I examined, but this one essentially looks at the number of reports issued as a percentage of all the complaints filed. I mean, you can do this a few different ways, but I really kind of wanted to get a sense, what when we get down to the issue of reports, not looking at findings, but just actual reports that get done. Again, Alaska, Wyoming, some of your small states, Delaware, California, not a small state.
Mhm.
But virtually all of those complaints that get filed get investigated and a report issued, which is pretty good. It's not bad.
Mhm.
New York is, kind of in the middle. And Connecticut is kind of falling off towards the end. So it seems like after that first phase, Connecticut is not getting as many reports issued on those complaints.
Well, Chris, I
Whatever.
got a concern. If you go back to the previous slide, Alaska was very high in throwing out complaint in withdrawn or dismissed, right?
No, they were
No.
the lowest.
So
They're lowest.
Alaska's complaints per thousand. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Yeah, Alaska's over here with looks like 3%.
Okay,
On-
okay. the
Only
rest-
3%
okay, They use
dismissed.
reports on the rest. Okay, yeah, okay, very good.
Yeah. So depending on the outcome, sometimes they're on the left or the right. And I'm always looking at this through the lens of parent outcomes.
Yes,
So,
yep.
okay. So the reports issued, little Iowa is not pretty anemic in terms of
Right, not doing
anybody,
much in terms of
anybody
reports.
getting anything written on paper that
Right,
comes to that
right.
office. It's pretty much
But Alaska's issuing a ton of reports. Look at them.
exactly. So
Yeah.
Alaska, whatever they're doing up there,
Yeah, they're actually looking at things and writing
they're
stuff.
looking
down.
at things, investigating things, and
Yeah.
issuing reports. Absolutely.
Actually, California, for a fairly large state, is
Yeah.
doing all right as well,
They are.
as is
Yep.
Massachusetts,
Yep.
all kind of clustered around there.
And then if you go to I know we're running short of time, I'll leave more time for Q&A, but if you go to the next slide, I thought this was an interesting way to look at the ratio of reports with findings. So basically finding problems, right?
Mhm.
To reports that were issued. So these are just of the reports with no findings. So a
So
one-to-one.
just explain, like reports
Yeah.
with findings means that there was a finding in favor of the parent or the
Yes,
filer of the complaint. Okay.
finding of non-compliance. So the parents issue that they are saying their allegation was
Is correct.
investigated
True.
and it was found to their complaint was found to be true, or their particular issue was found to be
Right.
true.
And on the other side, reports with no findings says that there was no merit to the report, to the complaint that was filed.
Exactly.
Right.
So
Because
if we
we've
had
already filtered out, statute of limitations and all that stuff with the dismissals.
exactly right. Yep. So so this is just of the reports that got through that they actually decided to investigate. They met the criteria. So a one-to-one ratio would mean half and half, basically. Half of the reports had findings, half reports did not.
Right.
So the District of Columbia has 7 reports issued with findings for every report
One
issued
without.
without findings.
Right.
So they're finding a lot of problems in DC.
As is New York, New York.
New York. Yeah.
Yeah.
Connecticut's right about in the middle, slightly more with findings than without.
Mhm.
Right at the national average. And then our friends again, Iowa, my home state, and Massachusetts.
With that big number at the front, of the
Right.
number of complaints being filed,
Right.
not
Exactly.
finding for parents very often.
Exactly. Yeah. So this tells some pretty interesting state stories about like what is going on
Yeah.
in that particular office. And then if you go to the next slide, again, I really wanted to kind of figure out who are the outliers, right? If there are some states doing really well and there's some states that are just, you look at all these metrics and they're on the bottom all the time. What I did is I picked out the top 10%, the top decile
Mhm.
in each of those metrics, and the bottom decile, the bottom 10%. And I tallied them up. So what I'm calling high performers, and I don't know if that's the right term, but these are the states that really seem to be finding and doing their jobs and finding on behalf of parents. You've got Wyoming, Alaska,
So Wyoming,
Delaware, Idaho, and
just
Nebraska.
to like simplify it a little bit for myself. So Wyoming, for example, in 4 of your 5 metrics, they were in the top decile of
Exactly.
that. And then if for low performers, Louisiana, not to pick on Louisiana, but was last in all the metrics, kind of
Exactly.
thing. Okay.
Yeah,
Got it.
exactly. Yeah. I didn't really see any patterns here other than some of the highest performers were smaller states and kind of Western states, generally speaking. Low performers more in the South,
Mhm.
perhaps, and the Midwest, Iowa, North Dakota, but this tells me something, and then there's a whole bunch of states kind of in the middle.
Mhm.
So if you just go to the next slide, and I think I'm going to wrap up fairly quickly. There are some other studies that have been done. The GAO did a study, I think it was actually 2019,
Mhm. Okay.
on the issue of written state complaints. And they also looked at it from 5 states, I think, including Massachusetts, but they found pretty significant gaps in terms of the outcomes by race, by income, and by geography, meaning whether they're rural, suburban, or urban.
Right.
So that's a very interesting study that also, in addition to having inequitable outcomes across states, within states, they found by these factors also variation in terms of outcomes.
Mm.
And then if you go to my last slide, just kind of some key findings and concerns, basically based on this and the research that I've done. Obviously, we just talked about equity concerns. It's obviously serving some families, some states, and some geographies better than others. The uneven state performance and the consistent group of states that appear to be what I'm terming underperformers, over time. I think it's very evident that there's very limited parent engagement around this process. States are required to do this, as I mentioned, under statute. And also just the parent confidence in the system itself is really not very strong. Parents are not confident that the system is going to actually work.
Mhm.
And then I think we've talked a little bit about this. There's really a lack of meaningful oversight and accountability in this area. And some of the research points out, and some of the government's own research points out really some pretty significant concerns around staff capacity within state departments of education to investigate, and training of investigators as well. So there's been some pretty good research on those particular issues and concerns. And I think that's all I had right now. So,
Well, one thing to note is that the due process system is hideously expensive. You need an
Right.
expert, you need a lawyer to pursue it. And so using that or even threatening that remedy is really only available to people with some money.
Mhm.
And the state complaint process, which is fundamentally free,
Mhm.
is a route where people of limited means can seek compliance with the law, can seek
Direct
justice.
compliance, yep.
And so it's the fact that it's a not terribly effective system is a real problem in terms of the equity of special education.
Mhm. It sounds like I know, at least from my clients, the ones that have shared with me their relative success or failure in the state complaint process are families that have engaged an advocate to help them in the process of structuring their complaint. And those are and that's anecdotal, obviously. So, perhaps there's a role for, training parents, obviously you said that the state is mandated to do it, but doesn't seem to be engaging parents in that. But perhaps there's a role for someone, to provide training for families in writing a state, in writing
Well,
state.
and there is a toolbox being developed in Massachusetts, which Chris can talk about a little bit more, and what we might be able to do to expand it.
Yeah, no, I'm fascinated by that, for sure. Tell us a little bit about that toolbox, because I think that would be really, really helpful. And I'm just writing things down about, having our own, training session on how to write a state complaint, or best practices in writing state complaints for parents, because I think that would be really, really useful. As Andy said, this is, one of the most, effective ways to seek change for your child's situation in in a school, without needing an attorney, without needing a neuropsych, without needing all of the things that are necessary for for a successful due process hearing. So really interested to explore how we could how that can be advanced. But Chris, I'd love to hear about a little bit more about what about what's happening in Massachusetts. I know we've talked a little bit about it offline.
Yeah, we're talking about tools that can really be helpful to parents. And I've been doing some research, and I was mentioning earlier, I alluded to a toolkit that I found fairly recently. There was one done by the Parent Information Center in Oregon called FACT. I'm not sure what that stands for, that they really kind of did a very nice kind of overview of state complaints and really kind of gave some examples. And then I think the Virginia Parent Information Center, and I'm not exactly sure their acronym, I think it's PEATE, P-E-A-T-E, took what the other group in Oregon had done and actually, in my opinion, improved upon it. Mm-hmm. And again, these are state specific, but in general terms, most of the examples carry over from state to state, because state laws don't vary dramatically when it comes to special education, because they're really under the guise of IDEA for the most part. But what you're referring to in Massachusetts, a group there at Northeastern University, and I should have had the name in front of me. I'm blanking on the law center's name. In Boston, was working with a group of law students to really do a deep dive on state complaints filed there, and obviously they're the most active state in the country, and really kind of coding those complaints around what worked, what got dismissed. And they're trying to build an interactive tool that will allow parents, if they've got a particular issue, to basically respond to a few questions, and it would help you kind of populate, if you will, a state complaint that hopefully it's got some evidence behind it in terms of what's worked, what hasn't worked. I know just going through the process today with these folks I was talking about here, I could just see how much they were struggling. They really wanted to write the whole story of what had happened to them and their child, which is all incredibly compelling and distressing, but it didn't really in Louisiana, right? Louisiana has a model form on our website, but it doesn't really tell you anything, right? It's just fill in this information. But I found myself kind of working with them to try to go back and restructure the information. But even then, I don't really know, is it this code or that code I should be referring to? You don't have to reference a code, but you at least have to tie it to some portion of IDA. But what's the solution? So I'm hopeful that this tool that the Massachusetts group is working on, and I think they're making progress. I haven't talked to them in recent couple of months, but I'm hoping that tool could be something that maybe they would be willing to share out more broadly with other states too. But that I think could be a game changer for parents, because it does still take a lot of time and effort, even if you're supposed to be simple, you're not supposed to need an attorney. But if you're just a parent who's got a problem, it's still a pretty daunting, step to climb to get that complaint submitted.
So I have a question from the, from the audience. Do you suggest one violation per complaint, or should you include all the violations you may have in the one complaint? We have experienced issues with the DOE picking and choosing which complaint they investigate, despite all of them being included. So that's, a great question. If you have several complaints, should you write a complaint for each one, or several issues, I should say? Or should it all be included in the same?
I don't know the answer to that question. I've seen seen both. I've seen in some states where the parent would file allegations 1 through 11, and the state would investigate all 11 allegations and come back with, allegation 1, yes, allegation 2, no,
Okay.
and so forth. But I don't know that versus filing 11 different complaints,
What the success.
what the success rate would be. I'm guessing, again, if you have the data, you could probably, find a data analyst who could help you find that, result. But I don't know, Andy, you may have better
Well,
insight. than I-
my view is that if it comes from a common nucleus of operative facts, that it all ought to be in one complaint.
Mhm.
But one thing you said that I think bears some emphasis is a good complaint is going to identify the section of law that's allegedly violated. A complaint that just says I was treated unfairly, this doesn't feel right, that's probably not going to be dismissed.
Mhm.
And so, it does take some level of expertise to actually draft a successful complaint.
Do you have other suggestions in terms of like what, general things you would suggest to parents about drafting a successful complaint? Obviously we went through the, the number of, of different complaints in one, in one complaint. What other things would you do or not do when, when filing a, an IDEA complaint? You just said include the cite the law, if you can, that's one.
Yeah, Andy might have, go ahead, Andy. I'll let you.
Yeah, I
go
mean,
first.
my view is a couple things. One, I'd use the Sergeant Friday rule, just the facts, ma'am, no emotion. Two, and I guess I'm really dating myself with Sergeant Friday, but I'll be glad to explain to classic television to anybody. Two, I would specify what was allegedly violated in each case, in each instance. I would attach relevant documents to it, and I would be clear as to each violation what relief I'm looking for.
Mhm. What about like if you're is there an opportunity? I know you said that there's no appeal in this process, when there's a finding of, when there's a finding, is there an opportunity to, to explore further, like ask follow-up questions, understand why, particular finding was made or not made? Does that really exist? You're shaking your head.
Not formally.
Okay.
I mean, in Connecticut, you can call Natalie, who's running most of the complaints, and say, why'd you do this?
Right.
And, or you can call me, and I can call Brian and say, what's going on here? Which I've done in a number of cases. Doesn't usually leads to reversal, it leads to an explanation of why they acted the way they did.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Why-
interesting. Most
Sorry, go-
states do not, although there are a few states out there that do have an appeals process. I'm not sure which exact states, but it's a very small number from what I understand.
Well, there's nothing in the statute that requires it. Yeah.
Right, it's optional, correct. Mhm.
What about withdrawing complaints? What would, I know, you were talking a little bit, Andy, about, districts starting to mediate these complaints, or, maybe asking parents to, withdraw complaints. Why would you, like, if you're in the middle of the complaint process and the district asks you to withdraw the complaint, or the investigator says, can you why don't we deal with this informally? What would be the pros and cons of withdrawing your complaint and seeking an informal resolution to the process?
It seems to me that there are only really two cases where I withdraw a complaint. One is I've given up on the state complaint process and I'm going to pursue this through due process.
Mhm.
Now, if you have a pending complaint and you file for due process, the complaint process is put on hold pending the outcome of the due process case.
Mhm.
And so, that's
Well, that's the reason, because if you feel like you might lose the state complaint, or the finding might be against you, you wouldn't want that. before you went to
Yeah.
due process, correct?
That's right. Yes, you don't want an adverse finding. And I suppose if it's, somehow communicated to you that the complaint's particularly weak, maybe
Mhm.
that might be a reason to withdraw. And I suppose another reason to withdraw is you file a complaint, the state or you copy the district, or the state sends a copy of it to the district, and the district's special ed director calls you and says, okay, we'll make the following adjustments, and
Mhm.
in exchange for you withdrawing the complaint, and you have the right to do that.
Mhm.
I mean, it does cost a district time and money to answer a complaint, even if it's valid, and it may well be in their interest
Mhm.
to get you to withdraw the complaint, and enough in their interest to do that, that they're all willing to give you something that they weren't willing to give you before. And then one other point I want to make is, in my, I know the bio said 25 years, it's more like 30 years of doing this. In my 30 years of doing this, so many of these disputes are just communication issues.
Yeah.
And it may well be that when the parent sends in their complaint and the district sees it, they say, we really don't have the disagreement that the parent thinks we have here.
Mhm. The, well,
And
as
then the one other thing I wanted to say about remedy is, you better make sure it's a remedy that's feasible. Asking as the remedy that the special ed director be taken out and shot in the public square is probably not something the state's going to order.
right, right. But that goes along with, just the facts, that you suggested in the beginning of, kind of this discussion about what would be the appropriate way to write a successful complaint, and, and staying away from emotion, is,
Well, but it's that, but it's also, the complaint could well say, I've been promised, an hour a week of speech therapy, and I've got no speech therapy this year. And the reason is because they don't have a speech pathologist who can provide the services. Asking as a remedy that the district be ordered to provide speech therapy is probably not a very good remedy in that case.
right. There's a question from the audience. Can you speak about withdrawing a complaint with or without prejudice?
So with prejudice means that it's, with prejudice against filing that same complaint ever again. This is not like a due process proceeding where that's sort of a major binding issue. Now, the only way you'd withdraw it with prejudice would be because the district offers you something and asks you to sign a settlement agreement that waives your right to file that complaint again. But a withdrawal does not in any way prejudice your right to go back to the state with the same complaint, unless there's some other document which where you agree to give up that right, and that right is one worth giving up if you get enough relief.
Do you have can you see what the district responds to your complaint as part of the process? Do you get to see, their response to your complaint filing?
Yes, but usually not until the final determination is made.
Okay.
Not always. Sometimes, the state does share it and ask for the parent to respond to it, but not always.
So normally what would happen is you would file the complaint, attach your relevant documentation, the district would respond to it, and then you would get the finding from the state. And then after you receive that finding, you would be able to request to see the entire complaint,
That's right. That's right.
correct?
Good
Okay.
file. Now there's one last question about neutrality, and let me just, the people who make these decisions are educational consultants within the State Department of Education. Our State Department of Education sees themselves largely as a management consultants to school districts. They're trying to keep them, straight and honest to the extent possible, but they want to maintain strong relations with them. So there's no pretense of neutrality there.
Mhm.
I think it's, look, when I get, clear violations, and on behalf of a client, I'll call the lawyer for the other side and say, hey, your client screwed up, get them to fix this. And that, that usually works. Because that's the job of a lawyer, to keep them out of trouble. And so I think the good folks in the State Department of Education who do this see their role as that. They do not see themselves as neutral arbiters. They do not see themselves as enforcers.
Enforcers.
Just make clear though, due process hearing officers and mediators are separate groups of people and are not the people who decide state complaints. Mediators work diligently to try to reach an agreement and usually have no agenda. We are really blessed to have 3 terrific mediators and 1 horrible mediator in the state, operating in the state right now. And the terrific mediators all have deep experience and can provide real advice as to what's actionable and what's not actionable. Due process hearing officers, this is just between us, and it is the worst group of fools that has ever been assembled. One could not find a less qualified group of lawyers anywhere on earth than the hearing officers in the state. And it's not necessarily that they're prejudiced against parents, although there are a couple of them clearly are. It's lawyers for school districts have much the same complaints about them. They just don't know what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. That's helpful.
Yeah,
Well, I mean, it's helpful. It's all information is helpful. You know what I mean? There are quite a few questions in the chat. I apologize that that we're probably not going to get to to all of them. I've got one final question that I'm going to ask. If the state attorney asks to speak with the district about this parent state complaint, is that advisable?
they're going to. I mean, it's usually done in writing, but sure, it's not, and it's not an attorney usually. I mean, Natalie is an attorney, but the people who handle complaints for the state are not necessarily attorneys.
Perfect. Well, it's a little after 8. I just want to thank everybody for joining this webinar this evening. To Andy, as always, for your vast depth of knowledge and experience, really in all facets of special education law. I've been on webinars recently where you weren't on it and we were all like, oh, where's Andy? Andy didn't know the answer to this. Your depth of knowledge is much appreciated. Particularly for a novice like myself. Chris, I am, really in awe of the work that you did in your work in this state complaint analysis. I'm a data junkie myself, so I appreciate, all the different metrics that you put together and, looking through the various data and state by state to draw, what are incredibly interesting conclusions, that, hopefully we collectively will be able to, to use to, affect more change in, the states that are underperforming, relative to the ones that are performing. So I thank you both so much for joining us this evening.
Well, can I put in one more plug if you're interested in this?
Absolutely.
Candace Cordiella is the world's greatest authority on this. Her group is called advocacyinstitute.org. And she has there's a huge amount of documents and links and charts that she has on that. She is really the go-to person on this.
Wonderful. Advocacyinstitute.org for anyone who is who's listening. Thank you both so much for joining us this evening. For our participants, this has been recorded. It will be distributed to all of you in a day or so, and will also be available on Facebook. Our next webinar is on April 12th, again on executive functioning. And thank you all for joining us this evening. Be well.
Thank you.